She sensed him before he touched her. A shift in the air, a presence too familiar to be coincidence. Winnie Dunn's spine went rigid as fingers closed around her arm, possessive, uninvited, certain. The bass from the gallery's after-party thudded through the marble floor, but it couldn't drown out the sound of her own heartbeat slamming against her ribs. "Don't walk away from me," William said softly. That was how he always did it. Quiet, controlled, as if the world belonged to him, and she was simply a misplaced object. Winnie turned, forcing a polite smile onto her face. Champagne sloshed dangerously in her glass. "I'm busy." His thumb pressed into the sensitive skin above her elbow. A warning disguised as affection. Around them, laughter floated. Crystal glasses clinked. Powerful people pretended not to notice the pollard air tightening his grip on the woman who used to wear his ring. "You don't get to be busy with me," William murmured. "Not after everything I've done for you." There it was. The velvet-lined lounge felt smaller by the second. Marble columns, gold accents. No clear path to the exits. Just William's family security positioned close enough to remind her that escape was theoretical. Her assistant had posted a story earlier. Celebration, champagne emoji, tagged location. William never missed those. "I told you," Winnie said carefully. "This is over." William smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "You're overwhelmed. I understand. My mother even found a specialist who—" The implication landed like a slap. 4 months free. 4 months rebuilding her career. 4 months of him showing up anyway. Flowers, apologies, subtle threats wrapped in concern. She scanned the room, pulse racing. No help, no allies. Only faces that knew better than to interfere with a Pollard family dispute. Then she saw him, a man seated alone at the edge of the room, half hidden by shadow and an enormous potted palm. Dark, suit, inked hands resting calmly on the table. Tattoos climbing his neck like secrets he didn't bother hiding. He wasn't watching the art, he was watching everything. His eyes lifted and locked onto hers. Something in her chest cracked. This man didn't belong here. He wasn't polished like the collectors or nervous like the artists. He radiated danger with the relaxed confidence of someone who had never needed permission in his life. William leaned closer. "You're not thinking clearly." That was when fear turned into resolve. Winnie didn't think, she didn't plan. She just moved. Her champagne glass slipped from her fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Heads turned, gasps rippled outward. She tore free from William's grasp and crossed the room in 3 unsteady steps, straight toward the stranger. Before doubt could catch up to her, Winnie grabbed the front of his suit and kissed him. Hard, desperate, claiming. The room froze. For one suspended heartbeat, the stranger didn't respond. Then his hand came up, firm, possessive, cradling the back of her head as he kissed her back with slow, deliberate intent. Not surprise, not confusion, acceptance. When he finally pulled away, his dark gaze searched her face. Not angry, not startled, interested. "Interessant," he murmured, accent curling around the word like smoke. "And who, Tesoro, are you trying to escape?" Behind her, she felt William go very, very still. And in that moment, lips still tingling, breath stolen, danger closing in from every direction, Winnie understood one terrifying truth. Whatever she'd just done, there was no undoing it. Before Winnie's story starts, I need to know you're real. Comment your location right now. I don't care if it's just your country or city. Just type it. Because here's what you need to understand. If you don't comment, if you just lurk and leave, YouTube buries this video. And somewhere right now, there's a woman, scrolling, trapped in her own nightmare, and this story could be the thing that changes her perspective. But she'll never see it, because you stayed silent, so comment. Prove you're here. Prove this matters, because your silence has consequences you'll never see. The stranger's hand was still cradled against the back of Winnie's head when reality crashed back in. His thumb traced a slow, deliberate line along her jaw, and she realized with sudden, crushing clarity that she had no idea who this man was, only that his eyes held the kind of darkness that didn't just threaten violence. It promised it. "Well?" His voice was quiet, almost gentle, but there was steel underneath. "I'm waiting, Tesoro." Winnie's throat constricted. Behind her, she could feel William's fury radiating like heat from a furnace. But the tattooed stranger hadn't even glanced in William's direction. His entire focus was on her, as if William Pollard, with all his family's money and influence, was nothing more than background noise. Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "I needed him to stop." The man's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like the expression a wolf might wear before deciding whether to play with its prey or simply devour it. "And you thought kissing a stranger would accomplish that?" He tilted his head slightly. Brave, reckless, but brave. He released her then, leaning back in his chair with the easy confidence of someone who knew the entire room would bend to his will if he simply lifted a finger. Around them, the after-party had gone eerily quiet. Conversations had died mid-sentence. Even the jazz trio seemed to be playing softer, as if afraid to disturb whatever dangerous thing was unfolding in the corner. William finally found his voice. "Winnie, what the hell do you think you're doing? Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? My family. Your family." The stranger spoke without looking at William. Just those two words, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. William's face went from flushed with anger to pale. Recognition flickered across his features, followed quickly by something Winnie had never seen there before. Fear. Real, genuine fear. "Mr. Morales," William said, and his voice had lost all its commanding edge. "I apologize for the disturbance. My fiancé—" "Ex-fiancé," Winnie corrected automatically. "Is clearly confused," William continued, though his eyes kept darting between Winnie and the man he'd called Morales. "She's been under a tremendous amount of stress. I'll take her home and—" "No." Santos Morales stood. He wasn't particularly tall, but something about the way he moved made the space around him expand, made everyone else seem smaller by comparison. "You'll go home, Mr. Pollard, alone." It wasn't a suggestion. William opened his mouth, closed it. His jaw worked soundlessly, and Winnie watched with a mixture of horror and satisfaction as the man who'd controlled her life for months looked like a child being dismissed by a parent. "This isn't over," William finally managed, though the threat sounded hollow even to Winnie's ears. Santos smiled then. It was the most terrifying expression Winnie had ever seen. All teeth and no warmth. "Oh, I agree," he said softly. "It's only just beginning." William fled. Actually fled, his family's security scrambling to follow. The other guests pretended not to watch, suddenly very interested in their drinks and conversations. But Winnie could feel their curiosity like a physical weight. She was alone with the stranger, with Santos Morales, whoever he was. "Thank you," she started, already backing away. "I appreciate what you did, but I should probably—" "Sit." It wasn't harsh, wasn't loud, but something in Winnie's legs obeyed before her brain could protest. She found herself sliding into the chair across from him, her hands trembling as she folded them in her lap. Santos studied her for a long moment. Then he reached for his glass, something amber and expensive, and took a slow sip. "Do you know who I am?" he asked finally. Winnie shook her head. "Good. That makes this interesting." He set the glass down with careful precision. "Let me educate you, Tesoro. In my world, a kiss is not a casual thing, especially not a kiss like that. Public, claiming, desperate." The way he said desperate made her skin prickle. "In my world," he continued, his dark eyes never leaving hers, "a kiss to a Don is a blood contract. You came to me for protection, and I accepted." "I didn't know—" Winnie's voice cracked. "I didn't mean—" But you did. He leaned forward slightly, and she caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something darker. Leather, smoke, danger. You chose me, Winnie Dunn. And now you belong to me. Until I decide otherwise. Her name in his mouth sent ice down her spine. He already knew her name, had probably known it the moment her lips touched his, maybe even before. I don't belong to anyone, she whispered, though the words felt like a lie even as she spoke them. Santos's smile returned, softer this time, almost fond. We'll see, he said. Won't we? And Winnie realized with dawning horror that she hadn't escaped William Pollard at all. She'd simply traded one cage for another. The only question was whether this new cage had a key, or whether Santos Morales had already thrown it away. 3 days passed before Winnie heard from William again. 3 days of radio silence that felt more ominous than comforting. She'd moved through her studio like a ghost, restoring a 19th century portrait that desperately needed her attention, but her hands kept shaking every time she picked up her brushes. Santos Morales hadn't contacted her either, hadn't appeared at her door with demands or explanations. It was as if that night at the gallery had been a fever dream. Except she could still feel the phantom pressure of his hand against the back of her head, could still taste the danger on his lips. Then Maya called. You need to see this, her assistant said without preamble. William's selling his penthouse, already sold. The listing went up yesterday and it's already in escrow. And Winnie? His car dealerships, all 3 of them, closed, just closed overnight. Winnie's paintbrush clattered against her palette. What? It gets weirder. His parents left for their house in the Hamptons 2 days ago. Emergency family business, according to their housekeeper. And William? Maya's voice dropped to a whisper. Nobody's seen him since that night at Crimson and Steel. The studio suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Winnie's windows overlooked a busy street, but now every passing shadow seemed threatening. Every car that slowed felt like surveillance. I'll call you back, she managed, ending the call with trembling fingers. She didn't have to wait long for answers. That evening, as amber light filtered through her studio windows, someone knocked. 3 precise raps that somehow conveyed both patience and absolute certainty that the door would be opened. Winnie knew who it was before she looked through the peephole. Santos Morales stood in her hallway wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than her monthly rent. Behind him, barely visible in the stairwell, was another man, tall, cold-eyed, watching. She opened the door because what else could she do? Mr. Morales. Santos, he corrected gently. We're past formalities, don't you think? He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning her studio with the practiced assessment of someone who noticed everything. The half-finished restoration on her easel, the books stacked haphazardly on her desk, the empty wine bottle from last night when she'd been too anxious to sleep. William Pollard made an interesting offer yesterday, Santos said conversationally, as if discussing the weather. $5 million, in exchange for me staying out of his business, for me to tell you I wasn't interested in continuing our arrangement. Winnie's stomach dropped. $5 million. The kind of money that could buy silence, could buy distance, could buy her freedom and leave her exactly where she'd started. What did you tell him? Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Santos turned to face her fully. In the golden light of her studio, his tattoos seemed to move. Stories written in ink across skin that had seen violence she couldn't begin to imagine. I told him that some things can't be bought, he said simply, and that if he contacted you, came near you, or even thought about you too loudly, I would erase him from existence. The casual way he said erase made Winnie's breath catch. He didn't believe me at first, Santos continued, moving to her windows. His presence seemed to fill the entire space. So I showed him what erasure looks like. His dealerships were built on loans from people who owe me favors. His penthouse was purchased with money funneled through a real estate group I happen to own. His parents' social standing depends on investments managed by my associates. He turned back to her, and his expression was almost gentle. I didn't take anything from him, Winnie. I simply reminded him that everything he has exists because men like me allow it to exist. And that permission can be revoked. Winnie sank into her desk chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. You ruined him. In 3 days. No. Santos crossed to her, crouching, down so they were eye level. I freed you. There's a difference. She wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that this wasn't freedom, just a different kind of cage. But the relief flooding through her was undeniable. For the first time in months, she could breathe without wondering if William would be waiting around the next corner. Where is he now? She whispered. London. His family has a small property there. Very small. Very far from here. Santos reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with surprising gentleness. He won't be coming back. Not unless he wants to discover exactly how deep my reach extends. It should have terrified her. This man who could dismantle someone's entire life with a few phone calls, who spoke about threats and violence as casually as other people discussed dinner plans. But instead, Winnie felt something far more dangerous blooming in her chest. Gratitude. And beneath that, something warmer. Something that whispered she might actually be safe for the first time in her adult life. Santos stood, straightening his cuffs with precise movements. The debt remains, he said softly. You came to me for protection. I provided it. Now we discuss terms. And Winnie realized that William's exile wasn't the end of anything. It was just the beginning of understanding exactly what she'd agreed to when she kissed Santos Morales. The terms, as Santos explained them, were deceptively simple. Winnie would move into his estate immediately. Not as a prisoner, he assured her, but as someone under his protection. The distinction felt razor thin. You'll have your own wing, Santos said, as if that made it reasonable. Your studio, your space, but you'll be where I can ensure your safety. Winnie looked around her studio apartment, at the life she'd carefully rebuilt after leaving William. Every paint-stained brush, every book she'd collected, every small piece of independence she'd clawed back. And if I refuse? Santos's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, something closer to disappointment. Then William Pollard will receive a very interesting phone call tomorrow morning, one that tells him I've decided you're not worth the trouble after all. He paused, letting the implications settle like ash. How long do you think it would take him to come back? Winnie's hands curled into fists. This was the cage, then. Beautifully presented, rationally explained, but a cage nonetheless. When? She asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Tonight. The estate was 40 minutes outside the city, hidden behind iron gates and stone walls that looked medieval in the moonlight. The car that picked her up was sleek and black, driven by a silent man who could have been carved from granite. Santos hadn't come himself, just sent his people to collect her like a package. Winnie watched the city lights fade behind her and wondered if this was how people disappeared. Willingly, one decision at a time. The house, when they finally arrived, wasn't a house at all. It was a fortress dressed up as Italian villa. 3 stories of stone and arched windows with gardens that probably looked beautiful in daylight, but now seemed like elaborate hiding places for things that hunted in darkness. Santos was waiting at the entrance, but he wasn't alone. The man beside him was taller, leaner, with silver-shot hair and eyes like winter ice. He wore a suit as expensive as Santos's, but where Santos radiated controlled power, this man radiated something colder: calculation, assessment, threat. Winnie Dunn, Santos said, his hand settling on her lower back with familiar ease. This is Cassian Drake, my consigliere, my oldest friend, and the man who keeps me alive. Cassian's gaze swept over her with the efficiency of a security scan, taking inventory, finding her lacking. Miss Dunn, he said. His voice was cultured, precise, completely devoid of warmth. I trust you understand the situation you've placed yourself in. Cassian, Santos warned quietly. But Cassian continued as if Santos hadn't spoken. You kissed a Don in public, created a spectacle, made yourself a target for anyone who wants to test Santos's resolve. Do you have any idea how many people would love to use you as a message? Winnie's spine straightened. She'd spent months being made to feel small by William. She wouldn't start that cycle again, no matter how dangerous this man looked. I understand perfectly, she said, meeting his cold gaze. I made a split-second decision. I'm still deciding if it was a mistake. Something flickered across Cassian's face. Not quite respect, but close. Then it was gone, replaced by professional neutrality. She's a liability, he said to Santos, as if Winnie wasn't standing right there. Untrained, emotional, connected to nothing that matters. If this goes sideways, it won't. Santos's voice carried an edge now, a reminder of who was actually in charge. She stays. End of discussion. Cassian's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Once. Sharp. I'll have Marco run security protocols. She doesn't leave the grounds without detail, doesn't contact anyone without clearance, and she certainly doesn't post anything on social media. He turned on his heel and disappeared into the house, leaving Winnie feeling like she'd just survived an audit and been found wanting. He's protective, Santos said almost apologetically. He sees threats where sometimes there are only people. Is he right? Winnie asked. Am I a liability? Santos studied her for a long moment. Then he smiled, and it was the first genuinely warm expression she'd seen from him. Oh, absolutely, he said, but I've never been interested in safe investments. He led her inside, through marble halls and rooms filled with art that probably belonged in museums, past staff who melted into shadows as they passed, up a curved staircase that felt like ascending into a different world entirely. Her wing, as he'd called it, was bigger than her entire studio apartment. A bedroom with a bed that could sleep 4. A sitting room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens. And a studio, empty and waiting, with north-facing light that any artist would kill for. I had it prepared this afternoon, Santos said. Your supplies will arrive tomorrow. Anything you need, you tell Cassian. He'll arrange it. Winnie walked to the windows, looking out at the sprawling darkness of the estate. Beautiful, isolated, perfect. This is a cage, she said quietly. A beautiful cage, but still a cage. Santos came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth, could smell that dangerous combination of cologne and smoke. All safety is a cage, he said softly. The question isn't whether you're trapped. It's whether you'd rather be trapped in here with me or out there with men like William Pollard. And Winnie realized he was right. She'd been in a cage for months, running from William, looking over her shoulder, never fully free. At least this cage had better lighting for her work. At least this cage came with a man who'd dismantled her enemy in 3 days. The question was whether Santos Morales would eventually become the very thing he'd saved her from. Winnie spent her first week at the estate like a museum visitor who'd accidentally gotten locked inside after closing. She explored carefully, touched nothing she didn't have to, spoke to no one unless absolutely necessary. The staff treated her with polite distance. Cassian treated her like a bomb that might detonate at any moment. And Santos treated her like she was already supposed to understand the rules of a game no one had explained. Then on the 8th morning, he knocked on her studio door. She'd been attempting to work on a small canvas. Something simple, something that didn't require her to think about William or cages or the way Santos's eyes tracked her every movement during the few dinners they'd shared. I have a commission, Santos said without preamble. If you're interested. Winnie set down her brush. I don't typically work on commission anymore. I restore pieces for galleries and private collections. This is both private and in need of restoration. He leaned against the door frame, casual in a way that somehow made him seem more dangerous, not less. My family's chapel, there's a fresco, 15th century, damaged by water and time and neglect. It needs someone who understands broken things. The implication hung between them like smoke. Why me? She asked. You could hire anyone, someone with more experience with religious art. Santos smiled slightly. Because you're already here, and because I'm curious to see how you work when you're not running from something. The chapel was tucked into the eastern wing of the estate, accessible through a garden overgrown with rosemary and wild thyme. The scent hit Winnie first, sharp and herbal and alive in a way that made the fortress feel less like a prison. Inside, the chapel was small, intimate, stone walls that held centuries of prayers and secrets. And above the altar, the fresco. Winnie's breath caught. It had been beautiful once. She could see that through the water damage and peeling paint, a scene of judgment, angels and demons, light and shadow. But time had been cruel. Whole sections had flaked away, leaving gaps like missing teeth in a smile. My great-great-grandfather commissioned it, Santos said, quietly behind her. From an artist whose name has been lost. Family legend says he was in love with her, that he built this chapel so she'd have somewhere to create that was only theirs. Winnie moved closer, her trained eye cataloging the damage, the missing pigments, the structural instability, the careful, delicate work this would require. It's salvageable, she said, but it'll take months, maybe longer. I have time. Santos stepped beside her, looking up at the damaged angels. And you're not going anywhere. It should have sounded like a threat. Instead, it sounded like a promise. They fell into a routine. Winnie worked mornings when the light was best. Santos appeared most afternoons, ostensibly to check on progress. But really, she suspected, because he was curious. About her process. About her. He'd sit on the stone bench near the back of the chapel, handling whatever business required his attention. Phone calls conducted in Italian and English and sometimes other languages Winnie couldn't identify. His voice would shift depending on who he was speaking with. Gentle with some, hard as diamond with others. She learned to read his moods by the set of his shoulders, by whether his hand went to the back of his neck or stayed relaxed on his knee. Tell me about the tattoos, she said one afternoon, 3 weeks into the restoration. She was on scaffolding, carefully cleaning a section of fresco that depicted a falling angel. Santos was below, reviewing documents that probably detailed someone's financial ruin. He looked up, surprised. It was the first personal question she'd asked him. Which one? He asked. All of them. Start anywhere. Santos set aside his papers, rolled up his sleeve to reveal the ink that covered his forearm. A crown of thorns wrapped around barbed wire. Names written in script so small she'd need to be much closer to read them. This one, he said, touching the thorns. I got when I was 16, the night I killed my first man. Winnie's hand stilled on her brush. She should have been horrified, should have climbed down from the scaffolding and locked herself in her wing. But instead she found herself asking, why? Because he was going to kill my father. And because in my world, you become a man the day you take responsibility for your family's survival. Santos's voice was matter-of-fact, not proud, not ashamed, simply stating truth. The names? Winnie asked softly. People I've lost, people I've failed to protect. He rolled his sleeve back down, covering the memorial written on his skin. I wear my sins where I can see them. Seems more honest than pretending they don't exist. Winnie descended the scaffolding slowly, her legs unsteady. She'd spent weeks seeing Santos as a force of nature, a category of danger rather than a person. But people who memorialize their failures on their own skin aren't monsters. They're just human, carrying more weight than most. The falling angel, Santos said, nodding toward the section she'd been working on. Why do you keep going back to that part? Winnie looked up at the damaged fresco. At the angel tumbling from grace, wings still spread, expression caught between defiance and devastation. Because I understand it, she admitted. The moment when you realize the fall isn't the punishment, it's the choice. And you made it willingly because staying where you were felt like a slower death. Santos was quiet for a long moment. Then he stood, closing the distance between them until he was close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "Is that what this is for you?" he asked softly. "A fall you chose." Winnie thought about William, about the kiss, about how she'd traded one kind of captivity for another. But here, in this chapel, restoring something beautiful from something broken, with a man who wore his sins like armor, it didn't feel like falling. It felt like learning to fly in a different direction. "I don't know yet," she whispered. "Ask me when the restoration is finished." Santos smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes, making him look younger, almost gentle. "I will," he promised, and Winnie realized she wanted to know the answer too. If you're still breathing after that scene, hit like, subscribe now, or lose me in the algorithm forever. That's not a threat. That's just how this works. The gala was Santos's idea, a charity auction for the city's art restoration fund, held at the estate's ballroom. Winnie had protested. She wasn't ready to be seen in public as Santos Morales' anything. But Santos had smiled that dangerous smile and said, "You've been hiding for 2 months. It's time the world knows you're under my protection. That sends a message stronger than any threat I could make." So Winnie found herself in a dress that cost more than her first car, standing in a ballroom filled with people who moved through wealth and power like it was oxygen. Santos's hand rested possessively on her lower back as he introduced her to politicians and business owners and people whose smiles never quite reached their eyes. She recognized the performance for what it was. Santos was claiming her publicly, making her untouchable by association. But what he didn't say, what hung unspoken between each introduction, was that he was also painting a target on her back. The evening was going smoothly until it wasn't. Winnie was examining a donated sculpture, a twisted bronze piece that reminded her of the falling angel in the chapel, when the lights flickered. Once, twice, then steadied. The room went quiet in that particular way that meant danger had just walked in. A man stood in the ballroom entrance, tall, silver-haired, wearing a tuxedo that looked painted on. But it was his eyes that made Winnie's breath catch. Empty, like looking into wells that had run dry decades ago. Santos's hand tightened on her waist. Not protectively, warningly. As if she were a dog he was afraid might bolt. "Silas Vane," Santos said quietly. Just the name. But Winnie heard everything he didn't say in those 2 words. History, violence, threat. Silas moved through the crowd like a shark through shallow water. People parted without realizing they were doing it. Survival instinct masquerading as politeness. He stopped 10 feet from Santos and Winnie, close enough to be heard. Far enough to give himself room to move if things went wrong. "Santos Morales," Silas said. His voice was cultured, almost gentle, the kind of voice that belonged to professors and therapists, not whatever he actually was. "I heard you'd acquired something new. Thought I should see for myself." His gaze slid to Winnie, appraising, cataloging, pricing. "Not something," Santos corrected, his tone pleasant and absolutely deadly. "Someone, and she's not on display, Vane." Silas smiled. It was the most terrifying thing Winnie had ever seen. All teeth and no humanity. "Everything is on display when you bring it to a party, Santos. That's the point of parties, isn't it? To show off our treasures." He took a step closer. "Though I have to say I'm surprised. You've always been so careful about keeping your personal life separate from business. This seems uncharacteristically reckless." Cassian appeared from somewhere in the crowd, positioning himself at Santos's right shoulder. His hand rested casually in his jacket pocket, but Winnie saw the bulge there. Saw the way his cold eyes tracked every micro-movement Silas made. "Is there a point to this visit?" Santos asked. "Or did you crash my charity event just to critique my choices?" Silas laughed. Actually laughed, like Santos had told a wonderful joke. "The point, old friend, is that choices have consequences. You know this better than anyone. You've built an empire on understanding consequences." He turned his attention back to Winnie. "Tell me, Miss Dunn, do you understand what you've become?" By standing here, in that dress, with that man's hand on your waist? Winnie's throat was dry. Her instinct screamed at her to stay quiet, to let Santos handle this. But she'd spent years being silent while William spoke for her. She wouldn't start that pattern again. I understand perfectly, she said, proud that her voice only shook slightly. I understand that scared men make threats at parties because they're too cowardly to make them in private. The ballroom went completely silent. Even the string quartet seemed to have stopped breathing. Silas's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those empty eyes. Recognition, maybe, or respect for someone, walking willingly toward their own destruction. Santos, Silas said softly, never taking his gaze from Winnie. You've chosen someone with spirit. I appreciate that. Spirit makes things so much more interesting when they break. He reached into his jacket, and Winnie felt every security person in the room tense. But what he pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a photograph. He placed it face down on the sculpture pedestal between them. A gift, Silas said. Consider it a welcome to the family present. I do hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. He turned and walked out with the same predatory grace he'd entered with. The moment the door closed behind him, conversation resumed like a switch had been flipped. People laughing, drinking, pretending they hadn't just witnessed a threat dressed up as social call. Santos picked up the photograph. His jaw tightened, and Winnie watched all the warmth drain from his expression. He looked, for just a moment, like the most dangerous thing in the room. What is it? Cassian asked quietly. Santos handed him the photo without a word. Cassian's face went carefully blank, which somehow was worse than if he'd looked angry. Show me, Winnie demanded. Her voice sounded braver than she felt. Santos hesitated, then turned the photo so she could see. It was her sister, Naomi, walking out of her apartment building in Brooklyn, unaware she was being photographed, unaware she'd just become a piece on a chessboard she didn't know she was standing on. The message was crystal clear. Santos had protected Winnie from William Pollard, but in doing so, he'd introduced her to enemies who played a completely different game. Enemies who wouldn't just ruin your finances or your reputation. Enemies who would burn down everything you loved and make you watch. Get her somewhere safe, Santos said to Cassian. Now. Tonight. I don't care what excuse you have to use. Cassian nodded and disappeared into the crowd. Santos's hand found Winnie's, his fingers threading through hers with surprising gentleness. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Just those 2 words, but they carried the weight of understanding that everything had just changed. Winnie looked down at their joined hands, at the tattoos that covered his skin like prayers and confessions, at the falling angel she'd spent weeks restoring. And she realized that falling wasn't the punishment. The landing was. The ambush came 3 days later on a road between the estate and the city. Winnie had insisted on visiting her old studio to collect supplies. Santos had insisted on coming with her, along with 2 security vehicles and enough firepower to start a small war. It hadn't been enough. The first car exploded without warning, just suddenly became fire and twisted metal and screaming. Santos's driver reacted instantly, swerving hard right, but the second vehicle clipped their rear bumper. The world spun, glass shattered, and Winnie found herself pressed against Santos's chest as their car rolled once, twice, before slamming to a stop against a concrete barrier. Out! Now! Santos's voice was calm. Too calm, the kind of calm that came from muscle memory and training and having survived this exact scenario before. He kicked out the shattered window and pulled Winnie through. His hand locked around her wrist like iron. Behind them, men were emerging from vehicles that had appeared from nowhere. 6, 8, maybe more, all armed. Santos positioned Winnie behind him, his body a human shield, and that's when she saw the gun. He'd produced it from somewhere, maybe an ankle holster, maybe thin air. His stance shifted, became something predatory and efficient, and Winnie realized she'd never actually seen Santos Morales at work. She was about to. The first shot caught an approaching man in the shoulder. He went down screaming. The second shot was quieter, center mass. No scream this time, just a body dropping like a puppet with cut strings. Santos moved like violence was a language he'd learned before he could walk. Fluid, precise, terrifying. Cassian appeared from somewhere, and together they carved through the ambush with a synchronization that spoke of decades fighting side by side. Winnie pressed herself against the concrete barrier, hands over her ears, eyes squeezed shut. But she could still hear it. The gunfire, the shouts, the wet sounds that meant bullets were finding flesh. Then silence, heavy and thick and somehow worse than the noise. "Winnie," Santos's voice, gentle now, wrong. "Look at me. Just at me." She opened her eyes. He was crouched in front of her, blocking her view of whatever lay behind him. But she could see the blood, splattered across his white shirt, speckling his face, staining his hands. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Winnie shook her head. Couldn't find words. Couldn't find anything except the understanding that this was who Santos really was. Not the man who sat in her chapel and talked about art. Not the man whose tattoos told stories of loss. This violence, this ease with death. "We need to move," Cassian said from somewhere behind Santos. More could be coming. Santos helped Winnie to her feet, but she pulled away from his touch, stumbled backward. Her heel caught on debris, and she nearly fell, catching herself against the barrier. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't touch me." Something flickered across Santos's face. Pain, maybe, or just recognition that she'd finally seen the truth. They made it back to the estate in a different vehicle, one that Cassian had called in. Winnie sat as far from Santos as the back seat allowed, staring out the window at nothing, processing, failing to process. Understanding that she'd been living with a monster and somehow not seeing it until now. When they arrived, she went straight to her wing, locked the door, pressed her back against it, and slid down until she was sitting on the floor, knees drawn to her chest. She'd been so stupid, so naive. Thinking that Santos's protection was somehow different from William's control, that the cage was prettier, so it wasn't still a cage, that the violence he'd used to exile William was somehow noble rather than just another flavor of brutality. Hours passed. The light through her windows shifted from afternoon to evening to night. Then a knock, soft, almost hesitant. "Winnie," Santos's voice through the door. "I need you to see something. Please." "Go away. I will, after you see this." A pause. "I'm leaving it outside your door. A folder, red. Look at it or don't. That's your choice." She heard his footsteps retreat. Waited 5 minutes, 10. Then opened the door a crack. The folder was there, exactly as he'd described. Red leather, expensive, innocent looking for something that probably contained horrors. Winnie picked it up, closed the door, sat on her bed, and stared at it for another 5 minutes before finally opening it. Documents, photographs, reports, all meticulously organized. All centered on one person, Naomi. Winnie's hands trembled as she read. There were surveillance photos of her sister, but not the threatening kind from Silas Vane. These were protective. Cassian's security team tracking her movements, keeping her safe. Then the reports, detailed accounts of 3 separate attempts on Naomi's life. 3 times men had approached her apartment. 3 times Santos's people had intercepted them. Quietly, without Naomi ever knowing she'd been in danger. There were financial records showing Santos had paid off her sister's student loans, had arranged for better security in her building without Naomi knowing where the upgrades had come from, had even ensured she got a promotion at work by quietly removing a rival candidate who happened to be connected to Silas Vane's organization. The last page was a handwritten note. Santos's handwriting, she recognized it from the chapel, where he'd sometimes leave her little observations about her work. "You asked me once if you'd fallen or chosen to fly. The truth is messier than either. I am a violent man. I've built my life on violence, and I won't apologize for surviving in the only way I knew how. But every drop of blood I've spilled since you kissed me has been to keep you and yours safe. That doesn't make me good. It just makes me yours. The question isn't whether I'm a monster. It's whether you can live with a monster who would burn down the world before he'd let it touch you. Winnie sat there, the folder open in her lap, tears streaming down her face. Because he was right. He was absolutely right. He was a monster. She'd watched him kill men without hesitation, without remorse. But he was also the reason her sister was still alive. The reason William wasn't slowly destroying her from a distance. The reason she could work in a chapel, restoring beautiful things instead of hiding in a studio apartment, wondering when her past would catch up to her. The question wasn't whether Santos Morales was dangerous. Of course he was. The question was whether Winnie could accept that sometimes safety came with blood on its hands. And whether loving a monster made her one too. Winnie found Santos in his study at 3 a.m. She hadn't bothered to knock, just walked through the door, still holding the red folder, her eyes raw from crying, her decision made. He was standing at the window, a glass of something amber in his hand, staring out at the darkened estate. He didn't turn when she entered, but his shoulders tensed, waiting for her verdict. "Teach me," Winnie said. Now he turned. His shirt was still, stained with blood. He hadn't changed, hadn't cleaned up, as if he'd been waiting for her in exactly the state she'd last seen him, refusing to hide what he was. "Teach you what?" His voice was careful, guarded. "How to survive in your world, how to be more than the thing you protect, how to stand beside you instead of behind you." She set the folder on his desk. "Because I'm not leaving, and if I'm staying, I refuse to be helpless." Something shifted in Santos's expression. Relief, maybe, or recognition that she'd just crossed a line there was no coming back from. "Winnie, you don't have to." "Yes, I do." She moved closer, close enough to smell the cordite and blood and fear that clung to him. "You said I belong to you until you decide otherwise, but it works both ways now. You're mine too, and I protect what's mine." Santos set down his glass with trembling hands. The first time she'd ever seen him anything less than perfectly controlled. "You have no idea what you're asking," he said softly. "Then show me." He did. Over the next 2 weeks, Winnie learned things she'd never imagined needing to know. How to shoot, how to move quietly, how to read a room for threats and exits. Cassian taught her with cold efficiency, treating her like a soldier rather than a liability. Santos watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable, his presence a constant weight. But they were out of time. The call came on a Tuesday morning. Winnie was in the chapel, working on the final section of the fresco. The angels were almost complete, their faces emerging from centuries of damage, beautiful and terrible and transcendent. Santos appeared in the doorway, and Winnie knew from his face that everything had just shattered. "They have Naomi." 4 words, but they contained multitudes. Winnie's brush clattered to the stone floor, paint splattering like blood. "When?" 6 hours ago. She never made it to work. Cassian's team found her security detail dead in her apartment. Santos's voice was flat, professional, but his hands were curled into fists. "Silas sent a video 30 minutes ago." He held out his phone. Winnie took it with shaking hands. The video was short. Naomi, bound to a chair in some concrete room. A blindfold covered her eyes. Her mouth was taped, but she was breathing, alive, for now. Silas Vane's voice came from off-camera, that same cultured, gentle tone that made Winnie's skin crawl. "Santos, I believe we need to renegotiate our arrangement. You have something of mine, territory in the port that your family took from mine decades ago. I'd like it back. In exchange, I'll return Miss Dunn's delightful sister. You have 48 hours. After that, well, I'm sure you can imagine." The video ended. Winnie played it again. And again, studying the background, the lighting, any detail that might tell her where Naomi was being held, but there was nothing, just concrete and shadow, and her sister's terrified breathing. "We're getting her back," Winnie said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Santos took the phone gently from her hands. "Cassian is assembling a team. We'll negotiate. Play for time, find where he's holding her, and go in with everything we have. I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. Winnie stepped closer, tilting her head back to meet his eyes. You don't get to decide that. Not anymore. She's my sister. I'm not sitting here waiting while you go to war. Winnie, you've had 2 weeks of training. This isn't some controlled exercise. This is real. I know. I watched you kill men on that highway. I know exactly what this is. Her voice shook, but she held his gaze. And I also know that Naomi is terrified right now. That when we find her, she's going to need to see a familiar face, someone she trusts, not just armed strangers, telling her she's safe. Santos looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned away, his hand going to the back of his neck in that gesture she'd learned meant he was weighing something impossible. If I let you come, you follow every order. No hesitation, no second guessing. You do exactly what Cassian or I tell you, when we tell you. He turned back, and his expression was harder than she'd ever seen. Because if something happens to you because you didn't follow protocol, I will burn down everything. And I mean everything, do you understand? Winnie understood. She was asking to step into his world completely. To accept not just the protection, but the cost. The violence, the moral compromises, the blood that would inevitably stain her hands. I understand. Santos nodded once. Sharp, final. Then we prepare for war. The team assembled in the estate's lower level, a space Winnie hadn't known existed, all concrete and weapons and tactical equipment. 12 people, including Santos and Cassian. Each one moved with the same lethal efficiency. Each one wore their violence like a second skin. Cassian spread blueprints across a table. 3 possible locations where Silas might be holding Naomi. Warehouses, abandoned buildings, places where screams wouldn't carry. We hit all 3 simultaneously, Cassian said. His cold eyes swept the room. Fast, violent, overwhelming. We don't negotiate, we don't hesitate. We go in, we extract, we eliminate any resistance. Winnie's stomach churned. Eliminate. Such a clean word for killing. Santos handed her a vest. Kevlar, heavy and awkward, then a gun, smaller than the one he carried, but still lethal, still capable of ending a life. Safety here. Point. Shoot. 2 to the chest if you have to. His hands guided hers, showing her the mechanics one more time. But your primary job is to stay alive and stay with me. Nothing else matters. Winnie nodded, not trusting her voice. They moved out at dusk, 3 teams, 3 targets. Winnie rode with Santos and Cassian, wedged between violence and calculated fury, wondering if this was what it felt like to stop falling and start flying, or if it was just another way of hitting the ground. The warehouse smelled like rust and decay and something chemical that made Winnie's eyes water. Team 2 had already cleared the first location. Empty. Team 3 was still en route to the third, which meant Naomi was here. Had to be here. Santos moved through the darkness like he was part of it, hand signals directing his team with practiced precision. Winnie stayed close, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. The gun in her hand felt wrong, heavy, like holding someone else's nightmare. They found the first body near a loading dock. One of Silas's men, throat cut, still warm. Santos examined it with clinical detachment. Cassian's team, he murmured. They're inside already. Which meant things had already gone wrong. Cassian's orders were to wait for Santos's signal, but he'd gone in early. Why? The answer came 30 seconds later when gunfire erupted from deeper in the warehouse. Not the controlled bursts of a planned assault, the desperate chaos of a trap sprung too soon. Santos swore in Italian and moved faster, Winnie struggling to keep pace. They burst through a side entrance into a vast, open space. Shipping containers stacked like building blocks. Shadows and angles and 100 places to hide or die. Cassian was pinned behind a container, returning fire against at least 6 shooters. His team was scattered. 1 down, not moving. Another clutching his leg, blood pooling beneath him. Suppressing fire! Santos ordered his team. Now! The world became noise and muzzle flashes and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Santos pulled Winnie behind a concrete pillar, his body shielding hers, but his gun never stopped moving. Acquiring targets, firing, moving to the next threat with mechanical efficiency. Winnie pressed herself against the pillar and tried not to think about the sounds. The screams, the wet impacts, the gurgling breaths that meant someone was drowning in their own blood. There! Cassian shouted over the chaos. Second floor office. I saw movement. She's up there. Santos glanced up at the rusted catwalk and the small office overlooking the warehouse floor. Windows intact, but dark. Could be Naomi. Could be another trap. Could be both. Cover me, Santos said to his team. Then to Winnie. Stay here. Do not move. Do not engage unless someone gets past me. Understand? She nodded, not trusting her voice. Santos moved toward the stairs leading to the catwalk. Fast but careful, always checking angles, always aware of threats. Winnie watched him climb, her breath caught in her throat, praying to gods she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. He was halfway up when Silas Vane stepped out of the office. He wasn't alone. Naomi was in front of him, no longer blindfolded, no longer taped, but a gun pressed against her temple, Silas's hand fisted in her hair. Santos, Silas called out. His voice carried easily over the diminishing gunfire. I'm disappointed. I gave you 48 hours. You couldn't even wait 12. Let her go, Vane. Santos stopped climbing, his gun trained on Silas, but Winnie could see the impossibility. One wrong move, and Naomi would die. Why would I do that? She's the only leverage I have now that you've killed most of my men. Silas smiled, that terrible, empty smile. Though I have to say, I'm impressed. You brought the artist. How delightfully reckless. His gaze found Winnie behind her pillar. She froze, feeling suddenly exposed, despite the concrete between them. Come out, Miss Dunn. Let's talk. Artist to appreciator. Don't, Santos said sharply. Winnie, stay where you are. But Naomi was crying. Winnie could see tears streaming down her sister's face, could see the terror in her eyes, the same terror Winnie had felt in William's grip, the same helplessness, and something in her broke, or maybe it finally solidified into something harder. She stepped out from behind the pillar. Winnie, no! Santos's voice carried a note of panic she'd never heard from him before, but she kept moving, slowly, hands visible, gun pointed at the ground, playing the role of frightened civilian, of someone who didn't understand the rules of this game. Let my sister go, Winnie said. Her voice shook. That part wasn't acting. She doesn't know anything. She's not part of this. Take me instead. Silas laughed, actually laughed, delighted. Oh, you're perfect. Santos, where did you find her? She actually thinks I'll make a fair trade. As if I'm not going to kill everyone in this warehouse and burn it down afterward. He shifted the gun slightly. Not much. Just enough. Naomi whimpered, and Winnie saw it. The angle. The opening. 3 seconds, maybe. Maybe less. She'd never thought of herself as brave. Had spent her entire life avoiding confrontation, fixing broken things instead of breaking them. But watching that gun pressed against Naomi's temple, she understood something Santos had been trying to teach her for weeks. Sometimes the only way to fix something was to break what was threatening it first. Winnie raised her gun, not at Silas, at the window behind him, and fired. Glass exploded. Silas flinched, just for a heartbeat, just long enough. Santos moved like lightning, up the remaining stairs, across the catwalk. His shot was perfect, precise, the kind of shot that required absolute certainty and zero hesitation. Silas Vane dropped, but not before he pulled his trigger, too. Naomi screamed. Winnie's ears rang. The world moved in slow motion as she watched her sister crumple, as Santos caught her, as blood bloomed across Naomi's shoulder. Not fatal, not the headshot Silas had intended, but still blood, still damage. Then Winnie saw the man emerging from behind a container, saw the gun tracking toward Santos's back while he was focused on Naomi, saw the moment when everything would end if she didn't act. No thought, no hesitation, just training and terror and love. Winnie raised her gun, aimed, and pulled the trigger. Once, twice, 3 times like Santos had taught her. The man fell. The warehouse went silent, just echoes and ringing ears and Winnie's ragged breathing. She stared at the body, at what she'd done, at the way the man's chest no longer rose and fell. She'd killed someone, saved Santos's life by ending someone else's. And the worst part, the part that would haunt her in the years to come, was that she didn't regret it. Not even a little. The gun clattered from Winnie's hand. She stared at it like it was a snake that had bitten her. Behind her, she could hear Cassian shouting orders, the sounds of his team securing the warehouse, checking bodies, making sure the threat was neutralized. But all Winnie could see was the man she'd killed, the way he'd fallen, the finality of it. Winnie. Santos's voice, closer now. He'd gotten Naomi to his team's medic, had crossed back to where Winnie stood frozen. Look at me, not at him, at me. She turned slowly. Santos's face was splattered with blood that wasn't his. His eyes were dark and tired and somehow gentle despite everything. You saved my life, he said quietly. Do you understand that? If you hadn't fired, I'd be dead right now. I killed him. Her voice sounded distant, like it belonged to someone else. Yes. Santos didn't lie to her, didn't sugarcoat it. And you'll carry that. I won't tell you it gets easier. But Winnie, you did what needed to be done. What I taught you to do. Naomi's voice cut through the fog. Winnie? Winnie's head snapped toward the catwalk. Her sister was sitting up now, the medic wrapping her shoulder. Alive. Injured, but alive. And looking at Winnie like she was seeing her for the first time. The ride back to the estate was silent. Naomi sat beside Winnie in the back of the SUV, her good hand gripping Winnie's so tight it hurt. She hadn't asked what happened, hadn't asked who Santos was or why armed men had rescued her from a warehouse. She'd just held on to her sister and cried. They settled Naomi in one of the guest rooms. The estate's private doctor examined her shoulder, removed the bullet, stitched her up with the efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before, prescribed antibiotics and rest and discretion. She'll be fine, the doctor told Winnie. The bullet passed through cleanly. No permanent damage. She was lucky. Lucky. What a word for being kidnapped and shot. Winnie sat with Naomi until she fell asleep, exhaustion and pain medication pulling her under. Then she found Santos in his study, staring at the same window he'd been at weeks ago when she'd asked him to teach her. She'll stay here, Santos said before Winnie could speak. Until we're certain there are no more threats. Cassian's already arranged for her job to think she's on medical leave. Her apartment is being watched. She's safe. Thank you. 2 small words for everything he'd done. Everything he'd risked. Santos turned to face her. William Pollard contacted me today. Winnie's blood went cold. What? During the rescue. He sent an email to one of my business accounts. Apparently he's back in the country, and he's broke. Santos's expression was carefully neutral. He's offering to sell information to the police about my operations, about connections he claims to have discovered during your engagement. Winnie sank into a chair. After everything, after Silas and Naomi and learning to kill, William was still there, still circling, still unable to let go. Does he actually have anything? She asked. No, his family cut him off when they realized I'd destroyed his reputation. He's desperate, grasping at anything that might give him leverage. Santos moved closer. But desperation makes people dangerous in different ways. He's not a threat the way Silas was. He's more like a wound that won't heal, a reminder of who you used to be. What do you want to do? Winnie asked. Santos smiled slightly. I want to know what you want to do. He's your ghost, Winnie. You get to decide how we exorcise him. The meeting was set for a restaurant. Public, neutral, the kind of place where violence would be immediately noticed and reported. William had insisted on the location, probably thinking it would protect him. He didn't understand that Santos owned half the restaurants in the city, that the staff were on his payroll, That neutral ground was an illusion when one side controlled the territory. Winnie walked in with Santos at her side, not behind her, not in front of her, beside her, partners, equals. The message was clear to anyone watching. William was already there, sitting at a corner table. He looked terrible. His suit was expensive but rumpled. His face was thinner, harder. Desperation clung to him like cheap cologne. His eyes widened when he saw Winnie, then narrowed when he registered Santos. "Winnie, I asked to meet with you alone." "And I declined." Winnie sat across from him. Santos remained standing, a casual hand resting on the back of her chair. Protective, but not controlling. "What do you want, William?" "I want my life back." His voice cracked slightly. "Everything I built. Everything your boyfriend destroyed. You owe me that much." Winnie laughed, actually laughed, and she saw William flinch. "I owe you nothing. You tracked me, controlled me, tried to have me declared mentally unstable when I left you. You want to talk about debts? You're the one who owes me years of my life I'll never get back." "I loved you," William said desperately. "Everything I did was because I loved you." "No." Winnie leaned forward. "You loved owning me. There's a difference. And the fact that you still can't see that is exactly why we'll never work." William's jaw tightened. He glanced at Santos. "And him? You think he's different? He's a criminal, Winnie. A murderer. You've traded one cage for another." "Maybe." Winnie didn't deny it. "But this cage has a door I can open whenever I want. Can you say the same about the one you built?" Santos's hand moved to her shoulder. A gentle squeeze. Pride, maybe. Or just acknowledgement. "Here's what's going to happen, William," Santos said quietly. "You're going to take the money we're offering, $200,000, enough to start over somewhere far from here. And you're going to sign papers agreeing to never contact Winnie again. Never speak about her, never think about her too loudly." "And if I refuse?" William's voice shook. "If I go to the police anyway?" Santos smiled. That terrible, gentle smile. "Then I'll stop being merciful, and you'll discover that exile was actually the kindest thing I could have done to you." The threat hung in the air like smoke, heavy and choking and impossible to ignore. William signed the papers, took the money, left the restaurant without looking back. And Winnie felt something inside her finally, truly break free. She'd been running from William for so long that she'd forgotten what it felt like to stand still, to face the thing that scared her and watch it crumble. Not because Santos had destroyed it, but because she'd finally stopped giving it power. "How do you feel?" Santos asked as they walked back to the car. Winnie thought about it. About everything that had happened. About the man she'd killed, and the sister she'd saved, and the ghost she'd just laid to rest. "Free," she said finally. Terrified, changed, but free. Santos took her hand, threaded his fingers through hers. "Good," he said softly. "Then we can finally start building something new." And Winnie realized he was right. Everything until now had been about survival, about escaping the past. But maybe finally they could start creating a future. Even if that future was written in blood and ink and broken, beautiful things made whole again. You made it. You watched Winnie transform from a woman running scared to someone who pulled a trigger to save the man she loves. Now here's your part. Hit that like button, not for me, for every person who needs to stumble onto this story next. Subscribe and turn on all notifications because the stories I'm bringing you aren't just entertainment. They're therapy. They're permission to be messy and brave and complicated. Comment the exact moment you knew Winnie was never going back to who she was. And here's the important part. Share this. Send it to one person. Just one. Because someone in your life is in a cage right now and doesn't know how to break free. This story could be their key, but only if you don't keep it to yourself. If this meant something and you don't engage, you're telling YouTube it was worthless. Don't let the algorithm kill what we're building here. I'll see you in the comments.